And I'm Don Haas. I'm today's facilitator for the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network and the Director of Teacher Programming at the Paleontological Research Institution. And lots of familiar faces on the call so far. James Damico, will be our presenter today, but we'll do some announcements first. And James, I have known since the 1990s. We went to grad school at Michigan State together, and I'm excited to hear him talk about his book. But we will go to announcements first. So folks have announcements. And James has a hand up. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Don. It's very nice in the Youth Climate Summit world, another program which is funded by the National Science Foundation, the Chief Science Officers is having for at least 2 weeks a virtual climate summit. There's 800 these Chief Science Officer youth that are in 15 states and 7 countries. We're participating in it. We're definitely going to be recommending that they join the Clean Network. They just do a lot of great programs. So there's an example of the climate world spreading out into existing other very important programs that are going on. I'll put some links in it. They are welcoming educators and climate activist people. I checked, that it's not just for their young people and their guests, but they'd love to have any of us be there, maybe from Clean. Thank you.
Great. And Gina's introduced herself in the chat, and folks can do that too. And Katie's got a hand up, so go ahead, Katie.
Hey, thanks. We are hosting a special webinar this month on April 20th. Well, first we have new pages in Clean, focusing on how to help address the mental health aspects of climate change. So kind of social emotional learning, as well as climate education. So check those out. And then Alicia, who helped develop those pages, and you all helped develop those pages last year, she hosted a Clean call about them and gathered a lot of input from you all to help her put those together. And then she's put them together in the last year or so and is hosting a webinar to try to help people walk through them and gain the strategies that she's put into those pages. So our webinar is sort of our special April event near Earth Day this year, but also helping us kind of let people know about those new pages. So check them out.
Good. And there's some links from Jim in the chat and some more introductions. Any other announcements? I will note that Marianne Krasny has a new book out. I don't know if any of you know Marianne. Excuse me. I'll put the link in the chat for that. Maybe of interest to some folks. Oops, that's not, I did not copy the whole link. Try that again. There we go. And I'm drawing a blank on the title as my computer loads it up. It's on teaching climate change, and she's taught a MOOC at Cornell for years with 1,000 students a term from around the world on climate change issues. So I'm looking forward to reading that. Are there any other announcements before I hand it off to James? Yes, Carolyn, go ahead.
I know that for most of y'all aren't really in the area, but if you know anyone that is, Clio is hosting a poster contest and 5K fundraiser in Miami on Saturday for Earth Day.
Awesome.
We've got kids from all over Miami-Dade sort of creating posters about what climate activism means to them, and I'm really looking forward to seeing their work.
Link into the chat for that. Any other announcements? Okay, I'm going to hand it off to James. First, I will say that James is the author of How to Confront Climate Denial, Literacy. So he'll be talking about more than just social studies in his talk today. And I will say that he has changed my vocabulary in the long term by, I now do not speak of anthropogenic climate change, but rather industry-led climate change, thanks to James's book. So I think that's an important bit in and of itself. And why don't you take it away, James?
Okay, thanks so much, Don. Let me share my screen here. Let's see which one is being shared.
I see a desktop at the moment. There's your slide.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to talk with you today. I'm going to talk about interdisciplinary inquiry, interdisciplinary approaches from moving from climate denial to climate justice. And I will start by talking about some early teaching experiences that I had as a elementary middle school teacher from the great state of New Jersey in the 1990s, and how I began teaching about the environment as separate from issues related to social justice. So for example, my students and I talked about pollution, and rainforest preservations was big at the time. And we also talked about social justice issues related to race and gender, social class, and indigenous issues. But I taught them as separate, as distinct areas of inquiry. And, to a certain extent, that reflected the times in terms of the environmental movement from the 1960s onward was led predominantly by white well-resourced groups like the Sierra Club. And they weren't addressing the lived experiences and needs of people living in communities most impacted by environmental issues, air, water, and land pollution. This is low-income areas and predominantly Black and brown communities. So that was then, and now is different. So in this article, I talk about coming to understand all environmental concerns entwined with aspects of justice, including racial, gender, and spatial or geographical justice. And for the past 18 years or so, I've been a teacher educator and a professor here at Indiana University. And I've worked with future middle school and high school social studies, science, math, and English teachers, and health and phys ed teachers, and content literacy courses. And one of the benefits of this course is to engage them in complex problems that are inherently inter or multidisciplinary, like globalization, healthcare, and climate change. And I'm particularly committed to creating conditions for students to evaluate different websites, often with conflicting claims and evidence, and have students dialogue across their own differences. So today I'll just talk about 3 different interdisciplinary instructional approaches I've adopted over the years. The first emphasizes how we determine which sources about climate change do we trust. The second targets techniques used to promote climate denial. And the third focuses on generative inquiry questions to pursue with students. So let's consider this first approach. And I employ a civic media literacy perspective across all of these interdisciplinary approaches. And it's media literacy because primarily I'm working with media, online texts and spaces with students. And the civic component is crucial too, because dealing with climate change requires civic engagement, and in particular, dialogue across different perspectives, and ideally developing shared understandings about the complex problems around climate change. So the first step in this particular model is to select different information sources for students to work with, different types of sources, sources have different purposes, a range of complexity, and sources are making different claims. So here are 4 sources I've used in the past. The top left is the IPCC source, the leading scientific authority on climate change. Underneath that, in the bottom left, is the NIPCC source, which is a climate science denial website that was created to counter the IPCC. On the top right, we have BP, the oil and gas company. and their climate change stories, that website, and the Christian Science Monitor, a news media sources on the bottom right. So I want students to take those sources and I want them to work with them, and with a primary focus on determining the reliability of each of those sources. And I give them 3 different times to do that. And I think that's really important, that they have time to process their thinking across 3 different intervals. So the first opportunity is just you have a screenshot of each of those sources, not unlike what you just saw. And I ask them to determine whether the source is highly reliable, somewhat unreliable, or unreliable. So they do that. Then they have a second opportunity where they can see the whole website, click on any links. They also get some prompts. These are questions about asking them to identify the author and the purpose and the sponsor of the site and the claims and evidence. So these kind of critical questions for them to engage with. And then I ask them the same thing, evaluate the reliability of that source after you've done that type of thinking. So they do those to have those opportunities to work independently, and then they shift to a whole class conversation. And here's where I want them to participate in a conversation. I call it 4 corners, or sometimes it's called take a stand. So for each information source, they'll stand in the corner that corresponds to their reliability evaluation. So for example, all the students who deem the BP oil site highly reliable would stand in corner 1. The ones who designated that as somewhat reliable would be in corner 2, somewhat unreliable would be in corner 3, and unreliable would be in corner 4. And then the students have opportunities to persuade their peers to change their minds, to try to pull them across the room into their quadrant based on the quality of their argument and evidence. So the questions I've had as a teacher and as a researcher around this is thinking about, when they get to the second time of evaluating the source with the critical questions, what happens with your reliability evaluations? And I have found pretty consistently that they do become more skilled at discerning which of those 4 sources are more reliable than the others. But one concern that has been pretty consistent is that I have a number of students who end up viewing the IPC source, right, the scientific authority on climate change, and the NIPC source, the climate denial site. They view them both as reliable. They view them both as reliable, and their main reason for that is, they want to have equal representation, or both sides need to be represented. So that's why we have to see these both as reliable sources. In terms of the second question, does the whole group conversation ever have an impact on helping them identify these sources as more or less reliable? And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. I want to highlight an example where it did, where looking at that climate denial site, the NIPC source, almost everyone in that class, over 24 students, thought it was reliable or highly reliable. And it took one student who was in the other corner that convinced them that it's not. We got to look at this source. You call the IPCC political, but its NIPC source is funded by the Heartland Institute, conservative, and so forth. And it was really one of these wonderful teaching moments where I just was able to witness a student convince these other students, and they all walked across the room to join him in that quadrant. So there's other examples, this kind of approach where the emphasis is on determining reliability or trustworthiness of sources. You can pair or juxtapose any information sources. What I've also have done is find pairs of students. So that first approach was thinking of just individual students, then whole group. But I've also intentionally asked students who identify across different climate change beliefs. That's the horizontal tabs on the bottom. Those are categories that correspond to the Yale Climate Change Communication Surveys. And so I try to find students with different climate change beliefs and across different subject areas. In this case, there was a student with a science background and a student with a social studies background, and other configurations of that as well. So what I've found in doing this is that when determining if a climate change source is reliable, here's what they say. They say things like, well, we need to consider the other side. So that I'm not sure if that source is reliable unless we actually engage with the other side. They also say things like, we're not sure the source is reliable. We want more information or evidence before we can say that's reliable. Or they say, well, the source is not reliable from my perspective because I'm a social studies teacher and all sources are biased. So I can't say that one source is less biased than another source. So to a certain extent, some of these perspectives are laudable, right? We want people to be considering other sides and wanting more information, but they're also problematic. There's no other sign about whether climate science is accurate or not, or whether climate change is happening. And whether you want more information before you can make a decision about something like climate science, there's no shortage of misinformation and disinformation to go out there and find. And so these are issues that need to be addressed as well directly. Okay, I want to move on to this second approach, which is to look at climate denial directly and identify what techniques are being used to promote or advance climate denial. So, and here's where it's really important to start with the science. And where are we now with the science? So, we start with a consensus in the climate science community about human-caused global warming. This overwhelming consensus has been consistent and persisted from these studies in 2009, 2010. I tried to present different images, get them thinking about what this percentage means. Here we see Ed Hawkins' efforts to portray global warming since 1850 as a series of color-coded stripes to highlight the shift from cool to warm over time. This is an easily understandable way for non-scientists. And here's another visual, this one from the New York Times, offering another metaphor to help grasp the reality of our historical moment and communicate the urgency for action. So the short answer to the question of where are we now can be answered in these 10 words, probably familiar to most of you here. And because I approach climate change as a socio-scientific topic, I'm interested in examining why some people don't accept the consensus, but it's still essential to be clear that there isn't a serious debate about the climate science as a starting point. So how did we get here? And this is where Don was mentioning earlier. It's industry. The three-word short answer to that question is industry-led climate denial. I think it's essential to stress that large fossil fuel companies are primarily responsible for global temperature rise. They, of course, were aided and abetted by other industries, including public relations companies, law firms, and financial institutions. But given this, I think calling climate change human-caused or anthropogenic is somewhat misleading. It's industry-caused or industry-led. This doesn't absolve individuals, especially those of us from the global north, of our responsibilities, but it does focus the critique on the industry and the influential leaders of this industry. And these large fossil fuel companies for decades have engaged in the campaign of deceit and deception and disinformation to manufacture doubt and confusion about climate science and to derail effective climate policy action. This network of fossil fuel funded, industry-led organizations, foundations, associations that again have functioned as this climate denial machine to influence politicians and to shape public policy. And this has been very, very well documented, these efforts. And again, large fossil fuel companies did not act alone, disseminating climate denial disinformation. Other industries are complicit. In my book with my co-author, Mark Belden, we named the public relations companies and the media corporations and the insurance companies and law firms and banks and financial institutions, as well as the agricultural industry, in particular meat and dairy corporations who have long worked in concert with fossil fuel corporations and anti-regulation efforts. And the recent book from Paul Hawken and his team from Project Drawdown also advocate the need for an industry lens for climate work. Okay, so now let's look at a couple of examples of what examining climate denial, these techniques being used here. And I'll just briefly highlight the climate denial inquiry model, which is something Mark Belden and I, along with our colleague Alex Panos, have worked on. And essentially with this model, we can investigate climate denial texts and related stories or myths or narratives that we live by. And we identified two different kinds of climate denial texts. These are climate science denial, which is a rejection of the scientific evidence, and what we call climate action denial, which is the refusal or unwillingness to take necessary actions to address the climate crisis. And others have called it action denial, solutions denial, which I think is similarly useful. We also investigate stories we live by. These are dominant myths or stories that we tacitly accept, often not being fully aware that they're operating as stories. You know, of particular interest are stories that promote climate denial, like humans are the center of existence, separate from nature. Nature is primarily a resource to be used by humans. And because those stories promote or condone ecological harm, they're considered destructive stories. There are also stories that are more ambivalent. They have aspects of what would be a beneficial story to the environment and destructive story. I think green consumerism is in that category of ambivalence. It's better to buy more sustainably sourced clothing and goods, for example. But if you're still buying lots and lots of stuff, then it's not necessarily beneficial. So that moves us into this kind of ambivalent category. And because stories shape how we understand and act in the world, we're placing them at the center of the model alongside the denial texts. And these texts and stories are shaped by the context we're living in. I'll talk about that in a moment. And our own ecological philosophies or ecosophies. And as the model suggests, we're trying to promote this movement from these more destructive stories we live by to more beneficial or ecological or eco-justice stories to live by. Okay, so we'll focus just on climate in the interest of time, climate denial texts. We'll look at a couple of those. These two examples are covered in greater depth, both in the book and in a recent article. So I just wanted to highlight those. So for this first example, it's just a Facebook video, a clear example of climate science denial, talking about climate change as fake news. What the left gets. And just to the interest, well, we can come back and listen to that if necessary. But the first step in the process of using this model is to identify science denial. This is a clear example of science denial. And if it is science denial, then our toolkit, what do we have to identify the techniques? Well, we have a wonderful framework acronym, FLIC, that helps us identify, well, what techniques are being used here. And this comes from the work of John Cook and others, that we can identify. If it's science denial, then most likely there's fake experts being used. There's logical fallacies in that text. There's impossible expectations. There's cherry picking, or there's conspiracy theories. And the book also by John Cook comes with a mobile app that is also really wonderful and fun to play with and useful. So in this particular example, they're fake experts. They quote a scientist. He's actually an economist. There's logical fallacies about CO2. There's clear examples of cherry picking, and also this kind of gesturing toward this conspiracy theory in that particular text. So here's another example. Again, we're going to start by what kind of climate denial is going on in this text. This is a YouTube video from the Shell Oil Corporation talking about its nature-based solutions. And in that video, they embrace the science. They're not saying climate change isn't happening, but are they taking the necessary actions to address it? And this is where the part of our toolkit, these critical literacy questions, how do we critically engage with material? We found these particularly useful. So if there's action denial or solutions denial at play, most likely there's some kind of discourse of delay or distraction operating in that text. And Lamb et al. Have their framework, and Supran and Oreskes have theirs, to help us think about, well, are they redirecting responsibility from themselves as fossil fuel companies to individuals or others? Are they actually just, are these non-transformative solutions that they're trying to portray as transformative? Is there greenwashing? Is there optimism that, don't worry about it because 10 or 15 years from now or 5 years from now, someone will invent a better device to suck all the carbon out of the atmosphere or something like that? So these are techniques that are used, again, that delay the necessary action that needs to be taken. And here's a visual of that taxonomy from Lamb and colleagues. So in that particular example of the Shell Oil YouTube video, they're definitely pushing non-transformative solutions in that example. They redirect responsibility to individuals. Fossil fuel solutionism, fossil fuel industry, we're essential to help solve this problem crisis, keeping themselves right at the heart of the solution. There's individualizing responsibility, and there's no shortage of greenwashing. The number of images of nature and so forth that are used they talk about harnessing nature and protecting forests and making it easier for customers to tackle their own emissions. And yeah, there's just a lot of greenwashing in this particular text. So there's so many climate denial texts out there. I just want to highlight a couple of databases that my students and I are using now and finding really generative. One is the library from the Center for Climate Integrity. This is a treasure trove of documents over the last 5 decades, internal documents of fossil fuel companies in particular, to show what they knew when they knew it. And DSMOG also has a wonderful climate disinformation database and Project Toxic Docs. And I see all these as opportunities to do kind of these like historical whodunit investigations to uncover all the ways the fossil fuel companies have engaged in their campaigns of deceit and deception and disinformation to, again, manufacture doubt and confusion about climate science and to derail climate action. And there's so many more examples of climate denial out there. And, whether it's in social media or websites or YouTube. Some other interesting tactics to note too, in this recent report, Denied, Deceived, Delay is a really wonderful resource showing how, these techniques of calling climate activists hypocrites or elitists, we can't trust them or believe them because, one of them flew in a plane or something like that. The absolutionism is quite prevalent too. This is the idea of, one country absolving itself from taking any action because other states or countries aren't doing it, right? So we see that image there about the Paris Climate Treaty. Why should the U.S. curtail any CO2 emissions if China and India aren't doing the same? And it's not surprising, of course, that renewable energy and electric vehicles are the target of these efforts. And I think it is important to note that these tactics are increasingly tied to or linked to free market ideology, right? As well as identity and cultural politics, like in electoral integrity or public health and vaccines. And any extension of government power, including climate action, is perceived as a threat to individual liberties. So we see this this linking or meshing of these identity and grievance politics and climate being kind of inserted into that mix. And also, there's a lot of talk about, well, we're beyond climate science denial, like everyone or most people accept it. There's a radical fringe who don't accept it. But most corporations, including fossil fuel corporations, are not outright denying the science. But there's still climate science denial out there. And some of these radical right-wing or fringe groups represent mostly ultra-conservative perspectives on the right. They're still influential and they're still putting out material. So we're not beyond climate science denial, just a note about that. Okay, so it's 2 approaches. We can look at reliability of sources about climate change and talk about their trustworthiness and debate and deliberate. We can examine specific climate denial techniques that are used in different texts. And we also can explore bigger questions. So I want to talk about these inquiry pathways we can pursue as an interdisciplinary approach. And the interdisciplinary perspectives tie closely to academic disciplines. I can see them here, the economic, political, historical, cultural, sociology, psychology, geography, media contexts, or perspectives can all be explored. So I want to just lay out some questions. This is not an exhaustive list of inquiry possibilities, but it does provide a way of kind of diving into denial. Just one note that these disciplinary areas or subject matter areas are tied to contexts of climate denial. So we talk about economic dimensions of climate denial. Well, we can talk about capitalism, we can talk about industrial capitalism, extractive capitalism. What are the political underpinnings of this? Well, there's a lot of partisan gridlock. We know the influence of corporate lobbyists. There's cultural historical context of climate denial. We can link to those dominant stories and myths about westward expansion, manifest destiny. There's legacies of colonialism. The sociological and psychological dimensions of climate change and climate change denial. We know about motivated reasoning, our tendency to read according to our own perspectives and biases, confirmation bias, our desire to be part of tribes, and our tribal affiliations affecting how we perceive information and issues. There's geographic dimensions of climate change and also media dimensions, especially this blurring of fact and opinion and real and fake news. So again, and these are denial contexts, and they're represented in this model too. We see them as kind of swirling around with, the philosophies or ecological perspectives we have as we engage with these stories and climate denial texts. So in economics, so some questions we can explore, and I've done some of these with students. Can an economic system of capitalism adequately address climate change? Questions about regulatory measures, which is a kind of political question as well as an economic question. Questions about neoliberalism and market-based responses. Will that help us address climate change? Questions about having prosperity without growth. So there's no shortage of interesting conceptual work out there, actually decades old, trying to understand the limits of growth, for example. And indigenous economic models are another way to help thinking about the economic dimensions of climate change. The politics and civics, again, if you think about the government's role in responding to climate change and actually promoting climate denial. Stories of freedom, how they support or combat climate denial. And a particular question we found useful is what best explains the range of climate change beliefs in the US, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence and consensus about the causes of human-caused climate change. The history pathways, questions about the historical context of climate change, climate denial. One question we've got have a lot of success with the past year or so was the climate crisis avoidable? This is where students get to look at a bunch of different artifacts from the past and think about, wow, what do we know when? And was that enough knowledge for us to change, or were the forces, economic or political forces, just too strong to make the necessary changes? So they engage with those kinds of artifacts. Again, thinking about historical narratives, understanding climate denial, and also religious and faith traditions and communities. In what ways have they contributed and or resisted global warming? The sociological and psychological questions. How do mechanisms of climate denial work? How's it affecting society? How is climate denial and action affecting our well-being individually and culturally? And questions about language. How do we use, what language might be most useful as we navigate the challenges of climate change? We know a lot about the emotional toll and psychological toll that climate change is having across populations, particularly the youth. So inquiring into those questions is generative. Media questions, these have been really well received by students too, especially the second question here and the third question. In what ways should social media be regulated? And should media companies, more generally, not just social media, accept fossil fuel advertising dollars? And geographical questions about the impacts on vulnerable populations, different parts of the world. where is climate denial a problem and why? It's much more pronounced in the global north and countries like the US, for example. And then personal questions that link to their community. How is climate change denial part of my life, family, and community? There's lots of more inquiry pathways, really kind of just scratching the surface here. Fossil fuel industry's role in academia, big tech's impact on climate change. The legal front is also a very active area for a range of investigations. Ever increasing number of towns and cities and states and filing lawsuits against fossil fuel companies, seeking redress for climate harms that their products have caused. Also want to emphasize how crucial the arts are to promoting inquiry into climate denial. There's countless creative projects around the world across all forms of artistic media and materials. And these projects help us understand the crisis and compel us to take action. And we just want to highlight a couple of Climojis if you haven't seen those before. It's also, so with these inquiry pathways, that these contexts of climate denial are also contexts for climate justice. So we can craft similar questions about all the work that's being done to promote climate justice across these dimensions, right? And there's just no shortage of that type of work. And a lot of that is framed with an understanding that climate-related challenges intersect with various forms of gender, racial, socioeconomic, and spatial or geographic injustices within the United States and around the world. And we need to become more informed about the range of these justice-focused projects that are already underway and help prevent or mitigate severe climate effects. And again, work towards different versions of the future. So these can be studied and investigated to see what's working and what's not working, and linking these studies to other justice-oriented struggles in the past. So again, here are the examples of the climate justice work, especially among youth here in the US and across the world, all worthy kind of inquiry topics to investigate. And the political dimension of this, the taking action is really important. So in thinking about how students and teachers and parents and administrators, all of us, working with students in different capacities can work toward participating in these wider policy discussions in our own schools and communities, and regional or national, even international settings. So many, this is just, there's dozens and dozens of wonderful resources and inspiring work going on around climate change. I know each of us here could probably list 15 or 20 books and other kinds of resources, podcasts. I think Drilled is probably has been the most useful podcast that I've listened to over the past several years. That's a deep dive into climate denial, in particular the fossil fuel industry's efforts to challenge the science and to prevent the necessary action. And coalitions of organizations who are committed to climate action against disinformation. And that's really the heart of this work for me. It's been around media literacy and working with misinformation and disinformation. And educators, there's lots of more curriculum resources out there. This is really just a little bit of a sample. I know the Clean Network gives lots of great stuff too. And so there's no shortage of stuff out there for educators of different stripes to use, appeal to. This is a recent website that I created to think about, and my colleague Mark Belden to think about this journey from climate denial to eco-justice. So that was a quick run through those 3 different interdisciplinary instructional approaches. And I'll just end here with just a few thoughts about this idea of stories we live by. Again, these tacit myths and narratives we tend to adopt without necessarily being consciously aware of them. And in our book, we talk about the shift from more destructive stories. Again, humans are the center of existence. Primary goal of a society is economic growth perpetually without limits. Consumerism is a pathway to fulfillment. Nature is a resource to be used for human purposes. So these are stories that are kind of circulating in our culture, and we enact them or believe them or adhere to them in different ways and to different degrees at different times. And we wanted to, at least in the book, highlight some different stories to live by that are more beneficial, that align with ecological justice. Stories like all life is treated with respect, care, and responsibility, especially for our most vulnerable populations and species. The primary goal of a society is human, ecological, and planetary well-being, with a recognition of limits. And the importance of civic engagement for common good is necessary for more just and meaningful lives and futures. And then there's this ambivalent category in the middle that tends to not get as much treatment from myself and from others in thinking about stories we live by. So I'll end here with just a recent project. I've worked with the religious studies professor, Lauren Leibarger from Ohio University, and we wanted to understand how communities were responding to environmental issues in the form of severe weather events. So we focus on just a single 29-minute sermon available on YouTube, publicly available. And we looked at how two evangelical Christian leaders responded to the campfire in Paradise, California, in November 2018. And these pastors were living and working in the adjacent community in Chico, California. So they had these, they have this sermon online to try to help their community understand that event. And in that 29 minutes, they talk quite compellingly and powerfully about what we identified as these three primary themes, that we're in this together. Together, we're going to make it through this, and confronting challenges can help us become stronger. Like these interrelated three themes, they're all overlap. And there are these ideas about community, hope, blessing, and solidarity that kind of course through this 29-minute survey as well. And these are compelling stories to live by. But we identify these as ambivalent because they convey an ambivalent position with respect to climate change and environmental issues more generally. So they contain this kind of beneficial story element, right? There's a common human identity orientation. They emphasize hope and resilience. These are all necessary responses to address the needs of climate disaster victims. But at the same time, there's no naming or consideration that this was an ecological event. And there's no ecological perspective that's brought to bear in the sense making. And they talk about the community, but there's not much of a sense of the community, the need in the community being beyond their particular church community, for example. So this was more exploratory and an opportunity to kind of think through these different stories we live by. This is by no means to make any claims about these pastors or this community as not engaging with ecological issues or whatever else they might have been doing in response to that crisis. But from this particular story, it was generative to start thinking about this idea of ambivalent stories. And I'll end with these questions, in terms of what I've been thinking more about, what destructive stories are we living by? Am I living by? Are we, in terms of my family, my neighborhood, my community, my institution, and so forth? What ambivalent stories are we living by? Am I living by? And in the different groups I'm part of? And how do we transition from destructive stories to beneficial stories? And how do we transition from ambivalent stories to beneficial stories to live by? So I will end there, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, James. That was great. There's lots of discussion in the chat, and I think I will just ask people to raise their hands, and maybe James can take a peek at the the chat, but raise your hand if you want to vocalize either one of those questions in the chat or a question not in the chat. Frank.
James, it's super interesting work. Thank you. One thing we're doing right now, and I put it in the chat, is we're updating the climate literacy guide from 2009. And one of the things that aligns with what your work describes was in the definition, which was, a climate literate person should be able to discern credible from non-credible information about climate. We buried it in the definition though. And we didn't actually put it into the essential principles and concepts that actually you would work on as educators or people to actually build that skill. So we are in the process of fixing that error from 2009 through a government process. But I'd be interested just to see if there's more contribution from yourself, your students, and or your partners in that process. I put the first listening session, which comes up on the 12th, but there'll be other ones as well. And it's a formal process with public comment. So if that's something that's intriguing to you, I mean, having those comments and those contributions as we open this process up would be, I think, crucial to getting what your work is describing as crucial fixed in the next round.
Well, I would love to be part of that. Yeah, thanks so much, Frank, for I'm going through the chat now. I don't see the particular link. Maybe I'm missing it here in the chat, but yeah, we can
it's
follow.
The one from 147. The comment of 147.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
All right, man. Thank you, James. Awesome work. Looks like others have questions.
James, may I ask a question? As fellow
Sure.
James. So I'm very impressed by your work. Don has spoken very well of it, and I concur. This is really great. It's really great to hear your presentations. It's, you're very thorough. You're covering things so well. This is, just a great resource on this. So with that as a preamble, to come up with something that I want to ask, is this an area that you may need to know more about or decided not to cover, or basically it's very hard to find something that maybe this is a missing subject here. Okay, so I want to get of this. When we look at specifically the fossil fuel industry over decades, I would say it is not just they have a marketplace of ideas, right? They have their ideas and they have their texts and they have their messages and they have their stories. But I think there's plenty of evidence, there's things we can speak of how they actively have worked to manipulate environmental education and climate education. They will approach, they will work with, they will defund people or fund people. They will go in and, for instance, an example of somebody gets interested in climate change. I've seen this so many times and witnessed it and be part of it. They will go to them and basically offer them money to either change it into something that's not scientifically accurate anymore, or offer money to drop the climate thing and do something else. That's something that just happens over and over again. And I found that to my dismay, so many people have a lot of respect for our programs have taken that money to do that. Okay, so what I'm saying is there's another subject for students and people to recognize and look at. Are we now at a point where it's okay to talk about that? Where people who are in environmental science and climate change will talk about, look, I've been approached by them, that this is what they offer, they do, or maybe I took this money in the past, that it's not a taboo subject, because I found that in the past, if you bring this up, you get ostracized. I've definitely faced, anytime I bring up something the fossil fuel industry has brought up to us or done something, it's like, you talk about that, we're not, you're out of the party now. You're bringing up something that we don't want to talk about. Is that something that you're aware of? Is that something you think is a worthy thing to add to your incredible tome of subjects? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, James, for talking about that. Our approach to this point, we've looked at, clearly the uncoke my campus, the influence of fossil fuel across the universities. And there's been a lot of investigative reporting around that influence. I'm less familiar with the direct ways that fossil fuel companies have kind of infiltrated some of the leading environmental organizations, and that you're speaking to. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. In the book, we do think of the fossil fuel companies being aided and abetted by these other industries, so just naming the law firms, who they are, naming the media companies, even the New York Times, have they promoted climate denial for decades and still do. They're still taking money from fossil fuel companies. The Guardian no longer does, but the Times does. And so, and the insurance companies and the banks and all, like, to how enmeshed all of these industries are. So we've done some of that. But I think, we're living at a time where it's dangerous to be a whistleblower, right? More generally in our culture, right? So you're speaking to the ways that we need whistleblowers that are naming these experiences, just like you're doing in this conversation, right? To give us these examples and publicize them and so forth. So I would love to learn more from you about this. So if you have resources, we can connect afterward to kind of dive into that. And I think that they'll be really, and what's true about students, my experience, whether they're middle school, high school, or university level students, they like this stuff. They like what's these corrupt folks or these deceptive tactics, or they're lying. Let's find this stuff out. They tend to really kind of enjoy that investigative work. So this would just add another really compelling layer there. So thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. Is it Carolyn?
Yes. I thank you, James, because I honestly kind of want to build on what you were asking. So I teach in Florida, and we are at the point where I work for an organization called the Clio Institute, Climate Education and Advocacy, and we're at the point where we're losing contracts with school districts because our material does not align with their curriculum. And
right.
I've brought this up on Clean Calls before. Like, we all know what that actually meant. And, we're having trouble getting into classrooms, and we're having to cut things like climate justice out of our slides so that we're not basically teaching illegal material that violates the Stop Woke Act. So any and all ideas, advice, at the very least commiseration, when it comes to trying to get this into an environment that is so actively hostile, would be very much appreciated, because, like I said, we're running into brick walls and we're getting shut out a lot more.
Well, I definitely wanted to, Carolyn, to connect you to my colleague, Alex Panos, who's been working at University of South Florida in the Tampa area. And she's been a colleague for a really long time around this. And she's been working with teachers across different schools who have these commitments and trying to find ways to kind of repackage what they're doing in more palatable ways politically. So that's moving away from particular language, right? Clearly, justice, climate, environmental justice is no longer palatable. But the emphasis that they're doing with just environmental issues more generally, where there's broad consensus or political consensus about preserving the Everglades and these other environmental issues that are really important as well. So I'd love I'd enjoy that conversation too with Alex, but I want to connect you with her, and I just took your name down, and I'll
just put my email in the chat as well. So
great. I will definitely get the two of you connected, or the three of us connected, because she's.
Yeah, we have our college advocacy chapters. We just brought 125 students from all over Florida up to the Capitol, and they spoke to legislators about a bill that we're sponsoring to, we're framing it in terms of, resilience and cost savings and putting solar on schools.
Right.
But yeah, we do have a student chapter at USF. and some of them personally know the kids who were arrested recently for standing up to some of the new censorship bills targeting higher ed in particular.
Right.
So yeah, if you don't mind, I'll talk to our USF organizer, and I would appreciate any and
Let's
all
do it. Yeah,
help this
let's
matter.
have that. Let's have that conversation. I think we're at a fascinating time now too, because we see what's happening in Florida and the radically different what's happening in New Jersey, where there's state mandated K through 12, every subject area has climate change and every grade level has climate change in it, right? So part of, I think, what we need to do more generally is to study what really works in that New Jersey setting, to how we can, expand that type of approach across states, right? And that's a big lift, obviously, given the differences that Carolyn, you're pointing to. But at least now we have some models out there that it's happening, and we can show it working, especially that the way they're responding to local challenges in New Jersey, the metropolitan area up there. So I think it's real promising. Frank?
So James, I also do work internationally. And as far as I understand, these issues that you're describing are really most concentrated in the US context, some in Australia, some in the UK, and some other places. But it's really those three countries where that is the most aggressively deployed. But what's interesting about it is that when you think about climate and going from climate science and understanding to impacts to action, there are challenges in all countries in dealing with this, and education challenges and community capacity challenges and awareness challenges that are not just generated by denial. Denial, I think, accentuates them and takes advantage of them. But it does. First, does that jive with you, that the background issue we are dealing with, independent of all what you described, is already challenging? And then to add this on top of that makes it exceptionally challenging. But that background work, I know we're almost out of time, but does that resonate with you, that environment is challenging before this?
Yeah, I mean, it's so complex and multi-layered and all-encompassing, right? I mean, it's just, and that's where I think the geographical lens there, the inquiry possibilities to try to understand those differences across spaces, but also the similarities in terms of the challenges. And I'm not sure how to respond to your question, other than I hear you kind of loud and clear about those challenges.
Yeah, I know we are at 2:00, but I could easily go another few hours, I think. And Dee's got a hand up, whoever's behind that. But I'll note, I put a link to an article by Sparkman et al. In the chat that's about a study that shows that most Americans of both political parties want climate change education at K-12, but they don't think that most Americans want that. So I think helping people to understand that it's the popular desire to have climate change well taught in K-12 is a really important effort. But I will go to D for the question, and although the hand is down now, so maybe not. But go ahead, and then we'll call it, I guess.
Okay, thanks, Danya. I'm real aware of the time. This is just a quick 1-minute question for James. As a teaching strategy, what % of time do you spend on the actual science, the actual sources, and what % do you spend on the deconstructing of misinformation? How do you balance that in proportion?
So, with that first approach I talked about, I didn't provide them any kind of science background. I just gave them different sources and just see what would happen when they evaluated the reliability of sources. The second approach, where I want them to detect the climate denial techniques, I start with the science and I spend 2 minutes on it. It's the 10 words, and making sure that they know it's happening, it's us, it's real, and we can fix it or we can do something about it, right? So that the rest of this inquiry in class is not going to be about whether climate science is happening. So that's the ground from which we're building from in the conversation. So, and that's where I end. That's the lion's share of my approach has been and will continue to be, like starting with that perspective. So I teach in social studies and language arts and math, social studies and language arts more than other areas. So I approach it as a socio-scientific issue, and so here's the science, and then here's the social science of it, and this is the where we're going to be exploring this terrain here, the social scientific aspects of it. And that could take, that exploration sometimes is like 10 minutes. You can look at one source and apply the Flick framework. You can do that in 5 minutes, just each day, like as an exercise to get nimble with that framework. Or let's look at discourses of delay. We give the students the framework and just look at different examples. It doesn't have to take, large amounts of time. It could be these little mini lessons to again help them thinking about, if it's denial, what kind of denial is this? It's science denial. Okay, I need Flick. If it's action denial, let me look at these discourses of delay, see what's going on there. So the third part with those inquiry pathways, they take longer. That could be 45 minutes to an hour to start wading into those waters. It could be longer units. I've had students work over several weeks on one of those questions. And it depends on the time I have. And I often have those grouped with partners, not with groups of 3 or 4, but just having a partner to work through one of those questions.
And unfortunately, I've got to sign off, but great discussion. And
well, thank you, Don.
Yeah, and
Thank
Jim,
you, everyone.
there's contact info for you, which I think might be on the clean list of presentations, but
It is. Yep.
I gotta
Thank you,
go.
everyone.
If it's there, great. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Gina.
you.
Very much, James. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Don. Thanks, everyone.